You've probably guessed by now, you might have sussed out by now that we've got a theme, and this theme is encounters with reality. So we've been looking at examples of people who, as it were, have had the veils of delusion between themselves and reality swept away. Their eyes have been opened, they've woken up a little bit to the nature of things. From the rather boring sort of dream that we normally live in to the vivid, colourful, beautiful nature of reality. And we've been asking, well, how can we get a bit of this? How can we get a bit of this? What does this person's encounter with reality tell us about how we can come more to face to face with reality? How can we make that more likely to happen? How can we practice, or how can we live so that that's more likely to happen to us? So we've looked at several different ways that reality can, as it were, get through to people, or has got through to people in the past. We looked at several examples of people whose eyes were sort of opened by an encounter with the historical Buddha. The historical Buddha, in a way, was deeply in touch with reality himself and communicated that to somebody in all sorts of ways. Not always welcome, but usually was. We've looked at people whose eyes were opened by reality itself, just life experiences, brought them face to face with reality. And last week, Satyajyoti, I think, talked about someone who had to pay the price for not facing up to reality, for living a lie. A life cut off from reality. But this week I'd like to talk about another way that reality can get through to us. Another way that we can awaken to more wisdom. And this is through meditation, through deep meditation. Suryamati, I think, alluded to something a bit like this when she talked about the great Buddhist traveller Tuan San, who travelled from China to India to get the true Dharma and take it back to China. And we heard how, in a way, in meditation, in dreams, it was as though reality called him to his life task. And of course, a few weeks back, we also heard about the historical Buddha. So the historical Buddha woke up to reality in this really major way. Through meditation, through deep meditation. And that was the event through which, if you like, reality, a big chunk of reality broke through to the human realm and has come down to us through the Buddhist tradition, even to this day. But this sort of experience of having an encounter with reality through meditation, it doesn't have to be confined to enlightened beings. It could even happen to us. If we practice in the right way. And this week I'd like to explore the story of a major figure from the Buddhist tradition who had that sort of experience in a very obvious fashion. And I'd like to explore what this story tells us, what this story can tell us about how we could use meditation to see reality more clearly, to come more face to face with reality so that we can live richer and more meaningful lives. And the person I'd like to talk about is the great Buddhist master, Buddhist teacher, Asangha, who lived in the 4th century of the Christian era. And Asangha was probably the single most important person in terms of founding a whole major wing of the Buddhist tradition called the Yogacara, which was hugely influential. It was hugely influential in northern India, until Buddhism was wiped out in northern India by the Muslim invasions. And it became hugely influential in Far Eastern Buddhism. It underlies a lot of the major schools that arose in places like China and Japan, like, for example, the Chan and the Zen school that became quite popular in the West. They're all based on the Yogacara tradition that Asangha played a huge part in founding. So we could say that Asangha was a sort of a spiritual genius. That's how we talk about it. This man's a genius. But Asangha did not think of himself as a genius, apparently. He did not attribute his genius to any qualities of his own, any wisdom that he could call his wisdom. He didn't think that, oh, I'm so wise and I've written all this stuff down. Take it from me. According to the tradition, Asangha tapped into a much sort of deeper or higher level of wisdom while in meditation. Something that came, as it were, from a higher place, from a higher realm, from a higher plane. Somewhere outside his own small, mundane personality. And what the tradition tells us about this is that this deeper or higher level of reality, as it were, dictated the Yogacara teachings to Asangha. Asangha was taught them. He was just the vehicle through which this wisdom flowed, if you like, into the human world. By his deep meditation, he created a sort of gap in the veil that lies between humanity and reality. And through that gap, a light shone into the world. But it wasn't his light. Reality broke through into the world and lit it up, but that wasn't him doing that in a way. So, yeah, I mean, it's completely central to Buddhism. It's a completely central idea in Buddhism that we can all have our own encounters with reality through meditation. If we practice meditation and if we live in the right way, that meditation can refine our minds, purify our minds in a way, strengthen our minds, so that we can see things more as they are, see more of the deep beauty and wonder, if you like, that underlies reality. We can be more inspired, and we can live more, as a result, we can live more inspired lives and meaningful lives. That is the ultimate purpose of meditation. The ultimate purpose of meditation is to weaken this veil between ourselves and reality, to strengthen, refine our minds so that we can see the nature of things more clearly. That's the ultimate purpose of meditation. I mean, meditation's got loads and loads of positive benefits, and I really hope that, you've discovered some of them. I'm sure, all of us have discovered some of the positive benefits of meditation. It can make us more calm and at peace, less blown around by events. It can help us to experience all sorts of enjoyable states of mind. It can help us to have more control over our mental states. It can improve our relationships with others. It can help us to just see the beauty of the world, to increase our enjoyment of the beauty of the world and our enjoyment of other people. It can be just plain blissful in its own right. And all of these are great. All of these are great in their own right. It's worth doing for all of those reasons. But none of those is the ultimate aim of meditation. The ultimate aim of meditation is to break through this veil, to help us see through this veil that separates us from reality, to wake up from the bad dream that we normally live in. And only that waking up can be the final permanent solution to the problems of the human condition. The other stuff helps a lot, but that is the final solution. It's just that normally our minds are so veiled, so divided and conflicted, so full of rubbish thoughts, tainted by all sorts of negative emotions, infected with all sorts of deeply ingrained views and attitudes, like seeing ourselves as the centre of the universe, seeing our own wants and fears as somehow valid and really important. Our own sort of silly, deluded wants and fears. And that sort of mind just cannot see things the way they are. That is the mind characteristic of a particular level of being, which we currently inhabit. If you sit a dog down to watch a Shakespeare play, it will not get the plot. The dog has to rise to a higher level of being to see the point of the play. And in the same way, we have to rise to a higher level of being to get the plot. To get the plot of what reality is about, we have to rise to a higher level of being. I sometimes imagine that we probably seem a lot like dogs to an enlightened being. Lovable, but living on rather a low level. Obsessed with lots of rather silly things, a bit like chasing sticks. And with some rather unpleasant habits. And we need to raise our level of being, rise to a high level if we want to see the plot of what reality is about. And that is what meditation can do if it's accompanied by leading a skillful life. It raises us to a higher level of being. When our mind becomes clear and calm and unified, suffused with positive emotions, that veil between ourselves and reality gets thinner. And maybe we're not going to wake up to the nature of reality as the Buddha did, just like that, at least not this month, maybe we're not going to. But I think it's a common experience to get inspired ideas, for example, to get inspired ideas, or to see that that problem that has been plaguing us isn't a problem at all. Or to just see something about the world in a completely new way. As though the clouds had lifted and it's obvious. Why hadn't I seen that before? Those sorts of weakenings of the veil between us and reality, I think they're really quite common in people who meditate regularly. So the traditional way of putting that is that insight may arise. Insight either with a big I or insight with a little I may arise in meditation. But I'm afraid this often gets badly misunderstood in the West, what that means. We tend to think of insight as something that just involves the head. A sort of intellectual knowing. But seeing reality is not just an intellectual knowing with the head. It's not a knowing of some sort of abstract, impersonal principle, like understanding a law of physics or knowing the GDP of Cameroon or something like that. We know reality as much with our heart as we do with our head. And I'll say a bit more about that later. Knowing reality does not mean seeing the world as a sort of dead machine, understanding it as a dead machine. It means much more seeing it as something living, something mysterious, something wonderful, something beautiful. Seeing it with appreciation and love. So, there's a long tradition in Buddhism of seeing what can happen in deep meditation, not as some sort of intellectual knowing, but as visiting a higher realm, a higher plane, raising ourselves to a higher plane or a higher dimension, visiting a higher dimension. We get examples of this in the very earliest texts from the Buddhist tradition in the Pali Canon. For example, where the Buddha, desiring to show something to a young man, manages to raise him up to a higher level of being and show him a beauty that he could never have imagined, that completely changes the way he wants to live his life. So the Buddha, as it were, takes this chap, Nanda, to a higher level of being, a level that the Buddha presumably frequently inhabits. So there's this idea that the world we experience, is really strong idea in Buddhism, the world we experience, the realm of existence that we experience, is the other side of our level of being. It's a reflection of our level of being. So a dog inhabits a doggy world in which sticks are really important, and sees, smells the world in that way. We inhabit a rather higher level of being. But then there are beings who inhabit a higher level still, a more refined level still. There are higher levels, higher planes, inhabited, if you like, by beings higher than the normal human in our normal state. And we can become a higher being, as it were, in meditation. We can raise our mind, our level of being, to a new level so that we can enter, as it were, higher realms. And we can live for a while on a higher plane. And while we're there, we can access a higher level of wisdom than the one that's normally available to us. We can be taught by a higher level of wisdom than is normally available to us. So getting back to Asangha, this is what the tradition tells us happened to him. Asangha was a great meditator. And the tradition tells us that he visited higher realms and brought back the Yogacara teachings that gave a new lease of life to Buddhism. And I'll say a bit more about that in a little while. So Asangha lived in what is now Pakistan, which then, in the 4th century of the Christian era, was the Gandharan kingdom, I believe. And some traditions say that his mother spent some time as a nun. And he and his brother, Vasubandhu, were, as it were, taught the Dharma from a very, very early age by their mother, who had been a nun. She inspired her sons with this deep appreciation of the Dharma. And both Asangha and Vasubandhu became monks, each in a different tradition. And fairly early on, they became monks in the sort of old-style Hinayana, if you like, schools. Fairly early on, Asangha converted to what's called Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle. And eventually he also converted his brother. He convinced his brother that that was the way forward. And between them, they had an enormous impact on the Buddhist tradition, both on the Indian subcontinent and then later as it went north and east. So as I've said, Asangha was a great meditator. He spent many periods meditating alone or in remote hermitages in the mountains. One tradition says that he meditated in solitary retreat for 12 years in the mountains, in a cave in the mountains. And during his meditation, the tradition tells us that he often visited a higher realm called the Tushita heaven. And while he was there, he received teachings from Maitreya, the future Buddha. So as I've said, according to the Buddhist tradition, we can actually access higher levels of reality in meditation. And the Tushita heaven is a mythic or a poetic or imaginative way of describing such a higher level of reality. And the future Buddha is, Maitreya, the future Buddha, is said to dwell in this higher level of reality, teaching the Dharma to anyone who can raise their mind to that plane, teaching the Dharma to anyone who can raise themselves up to his level. So Asangha, mythically, is said to have visited the Tushita heaven and been taught by Maitreya. He contacted a source of deep wisdom and clear vision that was not available to him in his normal state. It wasn't really his. It came from somewhere, as it were, beyond his normal personality. And it was from that his writings and his teachings flowed. So the great Chinese traveller that I talked about earlier, Xuan Zang, that Suryamati talked about, who walked from China to India to get the Dharma for China, he wrote an account of this, and he recorded visiting the place where Asangha the monastery where Asangha had been. And he writes, in a great mango grove 5 or 6 leagues to the southwest of the city of Ayodhya, there is an old monastery where Asangha Bodhisattva received teachings and guided the common people. At night he went up to the realm of Maitreya Bodhisattva in the Tushita heaven to learn the Yogacara and the Mahayana. In the daytime he lectured on the marvellous principles that he had discovered to a great audience. And these teachings that said mythically he brought back from that realm, they were given him by Maitreya. These breathed new life into Buddhism and had a profound impact on countless people in lots and lots of different countries down the ages. So that's the sort of basic story of how Asangha had his encounter with reality, how reality, as it were, broke through the veils of delusion in his mind and entered his mind, and from there went on to change the lives of many, many people. He meditated, and with his refined and strengthened and elevated mind, he entered a different plane of being. He became, if you like, a higher sort of being for a while, and in that state, he encountered reality in the form of the future Buddha Maitreya. And the future Buddha Maitreya taught him the deep Dharma, which he then translated into ideas and words that normal humankind can understand. And those ideas and words became the basis of the Yogacara tradition. That's the basic story. But there's another story about this, how this happens, how that happened, that maybe puts a slightly different slant on it, a very important slant, shines a different light, and quite an important light. This is a mythic story. I don't think it's meant to be taken seriously. You'll see why. But I think it conveys something important about the inner process, if you like, that went on for Asangha. It's a story about what was going on spiritually for Asangha. Mythic stories can express inner truths or spiritual truths that a purely factual account can't. And the mythic story, I think, the one I'm going to tell, tells something really, really important. Not just about what happened to Asangha, but also about how we need to approach meditation, how we need to practice if we are going to have our own encounters with reality, if we want to make ourselves a sort of suitable channel for some higher wisdom, if you like. So, according to this version of the story, Asangha spent 12 years meditating in his cave high in the mountains, as he did in the other story, but in this one, nothing happened. He spent 12 years seeking to break through to a higher level of reality, to contact Maitreya. Nothing. He got absolutely nowhere. So several times he gave up. He started the long, disheartened trek back down to the valley. But each time, just before he got to civilization, something happened that persuaded him to persevere. It was as though Maitreya sort of sent him a bit of a message or gave him a bit of a bait, oh no, come back, you're all right, come back. So each time he was persuaded to go back into his cave. Maitreya sent him a message, keep going. And he did this with his occasional trudges in despair down the mountain. He did this for his 12 years. But after 12 years, he thought, I finally had enough. I have absolutely had enough of this. I've been fooling myself. I've been thinking I was knocking on a door that was going to open, but actually I've been banging my head against a brick wall. There is no door. It's all a delusion. So he left his cave, and he started walking back to the lowlands, back down the mountain to the lowlands, very much with his tail between his legs. Dogs come into this quite a lot. He had just wasted 12 long years. Maybe he had wasted his whole adult life. Maybe the whole business of becoming a Buddhist monk was just a complete joke, a complete waste of time, total self-delusion. Maybe his faith in the Dharma itself was just a big self-delusion. And then we're told that on the outskirts of civilization, just before he got to the first human habitations, he saw an old she-dog in a terrible, terrible state. She'd been badly injured, and her wounds were crawling with maggots. And well, if you ever spent a long time in meditation, you know you get quite sensitive actually. So the sight of a dog with terrible wounds that are crawling with maggots just completely overcame him. He was completely overcome with compassion for this dog. He couldn't stand to see this dog suffering. And he was desperate to do something to help this dog. She needed to get rid of these maggots, but at the same time, we're told, he couldn't bring himself to hurt the maggots. So we're told, this is a mythic story, we're told that he prepared to transfer the maggots off the dog's wounds with his tongue, because that would be nice and gentle on the maggots. But what he saw in front of him was so disgusting that he had to close his eyes. So he kneeled down, he closed his eyes and put out his tongue. And then he had this tremendous ringing in his ears. And he thought, what's going on? He opened his eyes and the dog had transformed into the shining golden figure of the Buddha Maitreya. Shining with light. Shining with golden light. Miserable old she-dog had become the shining, golden, beautiful Buddha Maitreya, which should have been cause for great rejoicing, but according to tradition, which of course is a bit jokey, Asangha was in fact a bit peeved. And he said, look Maitreya, I've been meditating on you for 12 years in a cave, and not a glimmer of yourself did you show. And now, when I'm no longer in higher states of meditation, but actually doing something rather disgusting, you choose to show yourself to me. What's that about? And Maitreya answered, I was with you all the time. I was with you all the time, but you couldn't see me because you did not have great compassion. Okay, we're not meant to take this story completely literally. It's a great example of Buddhist hyperbole. There's lots of hyperbole stories in Buddhism, extreme stories to make a point. But the story does make a point. Maitreya, the future Buddha, represents the higher level of consciousness that Asangha was trying to attain. Maitreya represents the enlightened wisdom that Asangha was trying to access. Maitreya represents the reality that he was trying to have an encounter with. But Maitreya, the future Buddha, is the loving one. That's what his name means. His name is based on the Sanskrit word Maitri, which is the Sanskrit equivalent of metta. It means the being of metta, the being of Maitri. That's what he's composed of. If you like, enlightenment is composed of metta. If you like, reality is composed of metta. The future Buddha is a being of metta. Enlightened wisdom is a state of the deepest metta, the deepest positive emotion, the deepest empathy with other beings, the deepest sympathy and solidarity with other beings. If we want to connect with the potential for enlightenment that the future Buddha represents, if we want to raise our level of being to the point where his wisdom, that wisdom can talk to us, if we want to connect with our potential to become a Buddha in the future, we can't do that without having a mind which is imbued, deeply imbued with metta. So I don't know. Maybe Asangha. Why didn't Maitreya show himself earlier? Maybe Maitreya had been meditating in his cave, striving for blissful states, striving for attainments for himself. Basically, what he was doing was still about himself. His mind was not full of metta. It was focused on himself. And in that state, you cannot see things as they really are. It's only a mind full of metta that can know reality. So you can't know, think of some analogies, you can't know a piece of music by just knowing the score, knowing the themes, knowing where the key changes happen. To know a piece of music, you need to enter it. You need to break down, dissolve the barrier between yourself and the piece of music. You need to love the piece of music. That's how you know a piece of music. You know it with deeply appreciative love, a loving mind. You can't love a landscape. You can't sort of respond, really know it. You can't know a landscape by, say, you know, a sunset, by knowing the, I don't know, what would we know about it? The wavelength of the light that's coming off those trees, such and such, or the wavelength of the light that's coming from that sunset. You know a landscape by loving it, by appreciating it, by dissolving the barriers between yourself and it. You can't know another person by knowing all the facts about them. You can't know another person by knowing their birthday, their height, their weight, their bank account number. Might be very useful for other reasons, but you can't know them by knowing those things. Knowing their CV. You don't know a person by reading their CV. You know a person by dissolving the barrier that's between you and that other person. And the only way you can do that is with love. The only way you can know is with love, with metta. So to know reality, you can't do that just by a rational understanding of some philosophical view or some dharmic principle. You can only know reality, we can only know reality, if we dissolve the barriers between ourselves and reality. Enter into it with and we can only do that if our way of knowing is imbued with metta, if it's imbued with deep appreciation, the sort of metta and deep appreciation that dissolves those barriers. We know about reality. We know reality in the true sense with our heart as much as we do with our head. In fact, the way we know it is with if you like, a higher faculty that combines thinking and feeling. That's the way we appreciate a work of art, for example, with a faculty that combines thinking and feeling. And that's how we know reality. And this is a really important point about how we know reality for us in the West. Because knowing reality with our head is, in fact, what many Western Buddhists seem to try to do. We try to get enlightened, have deep insight, without necessarily cultivating the positive emotions, without necessarily cultivating the metta. We Westerners can be incredibly clever. I mean, compared to people in a traditional Buddhist society, we're often very, very well educated, very, very good at manipulating concepts. Very clever, very able to understand the teachings at a rational level. And we can be very attracted by those lovely, cool, spacious meditations like the mindfulness of breathing or just sitting meditations. And we want to get on as soon as possible to the higher practices, to the insight practices that open the door to enlightenment. But maybe we're not quite as emotionally literate, if you like, as people in traditional societies often are. Maybe we find the metta bhavana a bit difficult. Maybe we find really opening up to other people in friendship not that easy. So maybe metta doesn't come easy, so we want to get straight on to getting insight for ourselves. Not bothering with practices like the metta bhavana. But that isn't going to work. That just isn't going to work. We'll be fooling ourselves, knocking at a door that isn't going to open, as Asangha did for 12 years. Maitreya might be there all the time, but what Maitreya represents might be there all the time. We might even think that our own Buddha nature is there all the time, but it will stay completely hidden from us unless we have what Maitreya calls great compassion, unless we feel strong empathy for others, love for others, until we develop a warm heart of metta. So put very simply, for I think the great bulk of us, of we Westerners, the metta bhavana is simply the most important practice that we need to do. It's very often the one that Westerners want to avoid, but it is simply the most important practice that we need to do. Meditation practice. We also need to do the other things that help us to cultivate positive emotion, like cultivating friendships, for example. unless we find practices like the Metta Bhavana just come really naturally to us and just like falling off a log, as it were, those are the practices we need to do. It's a bit paradoxical that if we find it difficult, we need to do it. It just shows us that we need to do it. That's going to be most important for us. So I think it's one of the geniuses of the founder of the Triratna community, Sangha, that he recognised this crucial importance of metta and positive emotions, particularly for us Westerners. Faced with this tendency to see the spiritual life just in terms of one small aspect, getting insight, knowing, when he came to the West, Sangha just really clearly saw the need for a path that emphasised, to express the path in a way that emphasises that what's going on is a spiritual growth of the whole being, and not just of a bit of the head, as it were. Involves the heart and the will as much as it involves the head. So he formulated what he calls the system of spiritual development, or the system of spiritual practice, which I was going to write on the flip chart. The flip chart seems to have emigrated. And this isn't a new something he came up with out of nowhere. It's implicit in the Buddha's teaching, but he just made it really clear. And so this system of spiritual development basically has got 5 elements. The first element, you have to imagine the flip chart, is integration. Okay? The second element is positive emotion. The third element is spiritual death. And the fourth element is spiritual rebirth. And underlying them all is spiritual receptivity. We'll ignore that for the time being. So, integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. So, integration, it's a bit of a buzzword. I think it was originally used in this sense by psychotherapists like C.G. Jung, to describe the process by which a human being moves from being a bundle of conflicting motivations to being a whole, harmonious human being. We don't start out as a harmonious whole human being with all our energies and our desires moving in the same direction. It's a bit as though we are a bundle of people tied loosely together with a name and a body and a history. So we'll probably find that if we think about ourselves that we're a different person according to who we're with. We act differently with our family, with our friends, with our work colleagues, maybe differently with different ones of our friends. We're different in different places. We're even different at different times. We just have moods, so that, one time we're like this and another time like that. One day we can decide firmly to do something. We're absolutely convinced, I am going to run 5 miles a day. I am going to give up junk food. I am going to meditate for an hour and a half every morning. And we really mean it until 3 days later. And then it really doesn't seem like a very good idea anymore. It's as though there's a different person who says, who decided that? So there's no sort of central thread, there's no guiding continuous principles that sort of are the centre of our being, if you like. We're just blown this way and that by events around us, by other people, and even by our own changing moods. And meditations like the mindfulness of breathing really help us to integrate ourselves, to bring those bundles, bring those different people together, as does living ethically. When we decide to adopt some ethical principles, we've got some principles for living that we can unite our different selves around. Some core principles. We can begin to walk our talk, become of one piece, without a big gap between what we believe and how we act. So we could call that aspect of the path, integration, becoming an individual. The first thing we need to do is to become an individual, someone who can make their own decisions and stick to them, who isn't ruled by moods and isn't blown around by people and events. So that's the first thing we need to do, become an individual. Then the second thing in the list is positive emotion. Positive emotion. What Asangha apparently did not have enough of. See Maitreya. So, positive emotion. Emotions that are in accord with the way things are. Negative emotions are, so the Buddhist teaching tells us that we don't exist as a fixed and separate self. We don't exist as a fixed and separate self. We have a self, but it's a self which is constantly changing and is infinitely interrelated to other beings. Connected. Positive emotions are emotions that connect us. Negative emotions are emotions that cut off our connections, that keep us trapped in a tight, painful focus on ourselves. Whereas positive emotions connect us to others in the world around us. So, metta, you'll remember from the intermediate course some of the corollaries of metta: compassion, joy in others' happiness, sympathetic joy. We also talked about gratitude as being something that connects us to others. And we talked about in the intermediate course how these are some of the main emotional counterparts of wisdom, of seeing beyond our delusion of being a sort of separate, independent self, seeing that we are intimately interrelated with others and the world. So other positive emotions apart from those might be wonder and reverence and joy, things that connect us to the nature of things. And it's only when our minds are suffused with those qualities, according to Sangha, that we're ready to face the spiritual death and spiritual rebirth that an encounter with reality really involves. Our present sense of ourselves is based on a wrong view of who we are. So when we encounter reality, that deluded version of ourselves needs, in a sense, to die and be replaced by something more, something greater, something more universal. To sum up, the first task is to, if you like, become a happy, healthy individual, which is a considerable achievement, to become a healthy self. And then we go beyond even this idea of who we are. We could talk about this, what do I want to say? So then the next one, spiritual death. It's very often thought of in the West as a sort of death of the self. But aiming to destroy the self before we've built a strong, healthy self would be pretty useless, or actually even dangerous. And it seems to be based on a bit of a wrong interpretation of the Dharma. Because it's not that we don't have a self. We don't have a fixed, independent self. We do have a self. A self that's interrelated to others and which changes. And we need to think in terms of creating a better self. A self that's strong and integrated and imbued with positive emotion. And then we can think of going beyond even that self, even the limits of that self. Expanding, and it's maybe better than to think of, as it were, doing away with the self, to think in terms of expanding ourselves to include more and more people, expanding our idea of ourselves to include more and more people, to include more of the world. So I've sort of rephrased, if you like, this my flip chart, my imaginary flip chart here with integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. We could think of it as become an individual and then become a connected individual, which means an individual full of positive emotion. And then let go of being a fixed individual and finally become more than an individual. Become something more expansive and universal than just an individual, something much larger, part of something much larger than the limited self. And that is Sangha system of meditation, and I think it really brings home just the importance of positive emotion. Most of us are working a lot of the time on those first two stages, integration and positive emotion. We can, to some extent, be working on all four stages at once, but we're not going to go faster with the final stages than we've got, as it were, with the earlier stages. So we need to cultivate as much positive emotion as we can at the start of our Buddhist practice, and we need to carry on cultivating it as no matter how far we've got. Positive emotion is something we're going to need at every single stage. It's just absolutely part of every stage. It's only a mind that's imbued with metta and positive emotions that can know reality, hence experience spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. We can only inhabit the higher dimension on which Maitreya, the future Buddha, exists by becoming like Maitreya. If we want to become like the future Buddha, we have to become like him. And Maitreya is a being whose essence is metta. Maitreya, that's what his name means. So I think that's a really clear teaching for us. If we want to make ourselves into the sort of person to whom reality can speak, the way to do this isn't to look for some advanced insight practices, it is to cultivate metta. That's overwhelmingly important for the great bulk of us Westerners. Do the metta bhavana. That is the way we're going to become truly wise, see reality as it is, and make real spiritual progress and become enlightened. And hey, even if you don't want to get enlightened, even if you don't believe you can get enlightened, why wouldn't you want to cultivate positive emotion? Why wouldn't we want to cultivate positive emotion? If there is such a thing as happiness, it must be defined by positive emotion. Positive emotion is what happiness is, I think. Emotions like metta and gratitude, they connect us to others, they connect us to the world around us, they lead to an experience of fullness, richness and joy. Cultivating metta is a far more effective way of making ourselves happy than getting the latest gadget, or some new clothes or a new car, which seems to be the way that's offered to us. You can go, it's much more effective than an expensive holiday. You can go on an expensive holiday and be thoroughly miserable. Probably some of us have experienced this. If you're just focused on your own wants and resentments, or if you've spend your time falling out with your partner because you want to go to different restaurants, or I don't know, you can be thoroughly unhappy. But you could be happy anywhere, almost, I think, if your mind is full of positive emotion. That's what happiness means. If you've got a mind full of metta, the sorts of relationships that metta give rise to, it's the secret of living. Why wouldn't we want to cultivate it?